We'll get started. I want to welcome everybody to the webinar on supply chain hazards to aviation safety. And this is in cooperation with San Antonio, North Texas, and Lubbock FSDOs. And with me tonight, first of all, I'm Gary Mitchum. I'm the Airworthiness FPM for San Antonio. And I've got Ryan Newman, who is the ops side of San Antonio FAST team. And I've got Daryl Hughes from North Texas. He's the Airworthiness. And Dan Benjen from Lubbock. And he's also Airworthiness. And in the event we do have some technical problems, loss of Wi-Fi or whatever, just be patient, give us a few minutes and we'll try to work it out. One of the other presenters might be able to present from their computer. And also, any regulations that we reference in the presentation may be abbreviated or paraphrased. If you want to get the full regulation, we just recommend that you look that up. So the reason we developed this presentation is that just like the rest of the industry today, aviation has apparently been affected by the supply chain problems. We've had reports of oil filters being hard to get, batteries, tires, things of that nature. And if you have something to add, something that you have been having trouble getting, just enter that in the chat and we would be interested in that. So what we're going to talk about tonight is what is the hazard when there's scarcity of parts and materials. We're going to review the airworthiness requirements that are affected by the lack of parts and materials. We're going to look at aviation maintenance technology or technician responsibilities, and in specific, the performance rules. We're going to look at owner pilot responsibilities as related to airworthiness. Then we're going to look at parts and materials. We're going to look at the supply problems, the cause and effect, what's been happening. And then hopefully we have some best practices and options that will work for you. So a hazard as defined in Part 5, which is the Safety Management System regulation, a hazard is a condition that could foreseeably cause or contribute to an aircraft accident. And some of the hazards are, if there's no part available to replace a defective part, no materials available to service an aircraft, lack of parts and materials can prevent aircraft repairs, and this could be an increased incentive for unapproved parts in the supply chain. So those are some of the hazards related to this issue. So if we review airworthiness, the definition of airworthy, there's two conditions that must be met for an aircraft to be considered airworthy. The aircraft must conform to its type design, and the aircraft must be in condition for safe operation. So lack of parts and materials can cause an aircraft to become unairworthy. So looking at our chart, the process starts with the airworthiness standards that are developed so safe aircraft can be constructed. And this is the certification basis, whether it's the old car, Part 3, or Part 23, 33, and so on and so forth. Now, the manufacturer builds their aircraft to meet that airworthiness standard defined in those regulations. And the type design are composed of the type certificate data sheet, the drawings, the manuals, etc. So conformity to type design is one element of airworthiness, and that's what we're going to discuss first. And I'm going to turn it over to Dan Vengen from Lubbock, and he's going to cover that portion of the presentation. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, you started a little, you gave me slide 5 and you're giving it over to me on slide 7. So.
Oh, I'm on slide 6 right now.
6. All right.
Sorry about that, Dan.
Nope, that's fine. I just have to figure out where you were.
Can you guys go
All
full
right.
screen?
Aren't you seeing a full screen?
No, we're seeing Hollywood squares and then partial, just a smaller screen. And one of your attendees put something in chat with the same request.
He did, and I responded to him. I think it, what I'm seeing is not a 6x9, but a 4x3 format, which is what I think the present PowerPoint was presented in.
Okay.
I'm in presenter view. Can you see notes on the right side?
No,
Yeah, you shouldn't.
no, I think.
So I think we're in the full screen.
Thank you.
Try the view button in the top right corner, Jerry.
Well, mine says restore down, so I think I'm full screen.
Okay.
Did that make a difference? Maybe not.
And does it appear that Gary, that you look fine on my screen? Is it maybe that you've got your view options selected as a side-by-side mode, possibly?
Yeah.
I thought that would just affect my screen.
Now, if you go to your view options, the participants, you could select follow presenter's pointer and side by side. You can get rid of that side by side. It'll make it bigger.
Yeah, that's what I think maybe is happening.
Okay, so participants, if you'll minimize the side-by-side view, there's options of what you want to see. You can get rid of all that, all the attendee pictures that are over on the side. But we are presenting in full screen. Okay, Dan, go ahead with.
All right. All right, we'll start with the next slide. The next few slides will discuss the first elements of the airworthiness conformity to type design. Now we'll look at equipment that must be installed in the aircraft to maintain airworthiness. Remember, it must conform to type design. Equipment required by type design cannot be removed. Check the equipment list and the type certification data sheet. Generally, an ELT is also required by 91-207. There are exceptions, but for the most part, the ELT is required unless you're a scheduled operation, you're within 50 miles and training within 50 miles of an airport, single seat. But ATSB is now required, as well as the transponder. If you must fly without ADSB, you must request an authorization to the FAA Adept. Click. Website. If you can't make a request without an operative transponder with mode C, certain types of operation require specific equipment under 91-205. Here's a partial list from 91-205 for equipment required for day VFR. As you can see, for day VFR, you need to know your speed, your height, your direction, what your engine's doing and how much fuel you have on board, which is something people, even if it's working, don't use. Next slide. Smaller aircraft are type certificated under 23 normally. If what we're looking at here is the 150, if you notice, that's a car 3, but also at a certain serial number, it does incorporate FAR 23 in it. All right, next slide. The 150 type specific data sheet says that that's car part 3. It's a certification basis, and car 3 subpart F lists the equipment. And here's the required basic equipment in paragraph 3.655. And as you can see, the basic equipment must be installed. That means if you're flying, this stuff must be operational. The airplane cannot be flown without this equipment unless a special flight permit, or as you hear, a ferry permit is issued, because the aircraft is not airworthy with any of the missing equipment. The aircraft does not conform to its type design, and it must be safe for the intended flight if you're going to use a special flight permit. Yes, it may not comply with the TCDS, but that's why you get a special flight permit. But you have to make sure it is your job as a mechanic to make sure it is safe for the intended flight. Next slide. And I am from New York, so I may talk a little fast. All right, here's the equipment for a Cessna 172S. In the type certificate data sheet, the equipment list is a good place to look for required equipment. Notice the required equipment has an R next to it. This means these things must be required. You can't just remove it, placard the airplane because you don't want to repair the item. Required item cannot be removed because the aircraft will no longer conform to its type design. Next slide. And if you notice here, this aircraft has a Garmin Electronics PFD and an MFD. You'll see that the standby instruments are required equipment, and it's listed at the top of the table. And if you look, it's got the R as required. All items are required by type design because this does have the electronic ignition. All right. Electronic instrumentation. Go ahead.
All right, thanks, Dan. Okay, the second element of airworthiness is in condition for safe operation. So wear and deterioration occurs over time and use. More time and more use equals more wear and tear. Older aircraft or aircraft with high utilization just have more wear and tear. That would be like flight school aircraft, for example. So if you're working on these airplanes, keep that in mind. The parts will wear out quicker, generally. Now, condition for safe operation, since that is the term safe is in that element of airworthiness, what is safety? And that's defined as the condition of being safe from undergoing or causing hurt, injury, or loss. So the question is, when does normal wear and deterioration become an unsafe condition? So when normal wear and deterioration causes an aircraft part, structure, or system to no longer meet its type design, the aircraft is no longer in condition for safe operation. And here's a few examples. Tires worn beyond their specified limits, a seat belt that's frayed so that it does not provide the designed protection, and brake pads worn down so that metal is on metal, for example. And we continue to ask the question in this slide. And one way to answer the question is from the old adage we've all heard, it's an accident waiting to happen. And if you can sometimes just look at something and say, wow, this is just an accident waiting to happen. And if that's the case, it's probably not in condition for safe operation. So if a part is likely to fail due to the wear and or deterioration, and its failure will cause an accident or loss, and that's the definition of safety, it is not in condition for safe operation. It is not safe. So in addition to wear and deterioration, there's always damage that can occur, hangar damage, getting it in and out of the hangar, hail damage, so on and so forth. And the same thing applies. If the damage causes a part to no longer meet its type design, it's no longer airworthy. And you have to reference the manufacturer's damage limits to make that determination. If damage causes a part to no longer be in condition for safe operation, it's no longer airworthy. So to summarize airworthiness, what we talked about tonight, the aircraft must conform to its type design. And you need to reference the type certificate data sheet, the manuals, STCs, if there are any in the aircraft installed, the weight and balance. There can't be any unapproved modifications, no unapproved parts. Required equipment must be installed. Life-limited parts replacement has to be complied with. And we check the type certificate data sheet, the instructions for continued airworthiness, and the aircraft maintenance manuals to find the life-limited parts. And there's no damaged parts that no longer meet type design. In addition, the aircraft must be in a condition for safe operation. And that means the airworthiness directives are complied with. There's no excess wear and deterioration or damage causing an unsafe condition. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dan again, and he's going to discuss the next topic.
Performance rules. All right, we just had somebody ask about GoPro. Well, we'll answer that at the end. Aviation maintenance technicians are responsible to the related parts and can be found in the performance rules. What's a performance rule? These are the rules that tell us the minimum standards or minimum quality that must be attained when working on an aircraft. Performance rules for those authorized to perform maintenance are found in 4313, 4315, and 16. The rules are still required even though we may not have the parts available to make a good repair. All right, next slide. 4313 states that a person must use methods, techniques, practices prescribed in the current manufacturer's maintenance manual instructions for continued airworthiness. That is prepared by the manufacturer, other methods, techniques, and practices acceptable to the administrator. Going a little off here, that is a big thing for a lot of 65s. They're doing inspections and they're really not looking at the aircraft records and looking at ICAs because it's required for the airworthiness of the aircraft. Except for doing work specified in the airworthiness limitations section of the manual of the ICAs, they shall perform in accordance with that section. You also must follow the instructions of a airworthiness directive. The bottom line is follow the manufacturer's manual, ICAs, FAA acceptable methods, and airworthiness limitations. That is the bottom line. Follow the guidance. Follow your manuals. Next slide. Now we get into the part 121, 29, and 35. If you're working on an air carrier's op specs, you must use the maintenance manual of the air carrier. Each air carrier has a GMM or a maintenance manual. Or they have a continuous airworthiness maintenance inspection program or CAMP. Next slide. They shall use tools, equipment, and test apparatus necessary to ensure the work is complete in accordance with acceptable industry practices. You have to have the right tool for the job. Special test equipment or apparatus recommended by the manufacturer equivalent to the FAA. So you may not have the latest, greatest, but it has to be equivalent or acceptable. Me being an avionics guy, you know, we used to have the old pump up type when you're doing the 413, 411, 413s. They were hard. They were very labor intensive. And now you have the new ones. You can just press a button. It doesn't have to be the latest and greatest, but it has to be equivalent. Next slide. Both individuals and repair stations have rules for returning to service an article that they work on. 4313 states that the workmanship and materials used performing maintenance must restore to the item to at least the original or properly altered condition. This quality requirement in mind. All right, keep this in mind because your brokers, your parts brokers are not under the purview of the FAA. So understand that you are responsible. As a repair station, they must inspect the article before return to service, and they will follow their quality system. It's important to note the repair station can only work on items they're rated for. And understand that those parts that you get, you are responsible for the parts that you install. Next slide. There are additional performance rules for inspection. Determine that the aircraft and portions of the aircraft meet all applicable airworthiness standards. This includes ADs, and of course, all required parts and equipment must be installed. 125, 135, and 91409E perform in accordance with the inspection program. The rotorcraft, make sure that you're following the maintenance manual and the ICAs. Pay particular attention to drive shafts, main rotor, transmission gearboxes. The annual 100-hour, you shall use a checklist and that scope and detail of the 43 Appendix D. A lot of people say, well, they use it, but they don't have a checklist. Remember, for maintenance log entries, you are stating the work performed is approved for return to service and airworthy. A log entry for an inspection has a certification statement that the entire aircraft is airworthy. This means the aircraft conforms to its type design and is in a condition for safe operation. Appendix D does not specify looking for required equipment and placards, but it's still required. And on that note, when you do an annual inspection, normally it says the aircraft has been inspected, which includes the rest of the aircraft. Next slide. Owners and operators are required by 91-405 to have the aircraft inspected under 91E and defects repaired under 43. No person may operate a civil aircraft unless it's in airworthy condition. So you got to make sure that the aircraft has been repaired between inspections. I don't know how many times we found a perfectly good airplane crashed, and you know it's perfectly good because the only thing it's ever had was inspections. And I will turn this over to Gary.
All right, thanks, Dan. So we looked at aviation maintenance technician responsibilities, and we looked at the performance rules that they have to follow. And we also, with this slide, we looked at owner and pilot responsibilities. And we're just keep in mind, we're trying to relate this to the topic of possibly not having the parts or the materials. So these rules are still in effect even when we have those shortages. And you need parts and materials to maintain airworthiness. And we saw some of the factors that come into play, wear and tear, damage, parts failure, or they reach their life limit. Look at the equipment list. Required parts are need to be there. And also the type certificate data sheet, airworthiness limitations section. And also airspace can require certain parts and equipment. For instance, transponder, ADSB, VFR day equipment under 91205. So what are the options when no parts are available? Well, unfortunately, there's not a lot of options available. An aircraft could just be restricted if the part is only required for certain operations. For example, if your landing light is out and you're, then you'd be restricted from night operations. And unfortunately, if the required part is not available or missing, the aircraft's not airworthy and it's grounded. And nobody wants to have grounded aircraft, but we also don't want to fly aircraft that are not safe. So if the equipment is inoperative, the aircraft is grounded, but there are two options available. And so let's ask the question, and we'll give you a minute to answer this. If you want to type it in the chat, what are the two options available that allow continued flight with inoperative equipment? And this does not include a ferry permit. That would be a third option, but it's only going to get you to a place where the repair could be made. So I'll give you a couple minutes if you want to answer that question. I don't have the Jeopardy theme song that I can play, but okay, so the two options are you can remove the part and placard it, deactivate it, but it must be a part that is eligible for removal under part 91-213D. Or you could use an MEL if there is an MEL and letter of authorization issued to the operator. And in that case, if the part doesn't come along within the required repair interval, you could ask for an extension. And we're going to look at these two options in the next few slides. So the basics of flying with inoperative equipment as to whether or not you're allowed. First of all, it's governed by 91-213D, but you must use an MEL and letter of authorization if they've been issued. If there is no MEL LOA issued or required, then the equipment can be inoperative if those criteria are met. It can't be listed as required in the equipment list. As we saw before, we looked at the required equipment because that's part of the type design. The inoperative equipment cannot be listed as required by 91-205, which is VFR day conditions. The equipment cannot be inoperative if it's required in the airspace that you are operating in. And it can't be inoperative if it's listed as required by an AD. So if it meets all those criteria, the equipment can be deactivated and placarded or removed and placarded, but it must be repaired or replaced or removed or inspected at the next required inspection. So can it be inoperative forever? Well, one of these things has to be done at the next required inspection under Part 91-205. Has to be repaired, replaced, or removed. Can it be removed permanently? Yes. It can, because the regulation itself states that aircraft with items removed under 91-213D are considered to be in a properly altered condition. Now, if the item is removed, you have to make sure the weight and balance and equipment list are updated. Items that are not repaired, replaced, or removed, in other words, it's deactivated and placarded, it must be inspected at the next and every required inspection thereafter. And that's spelled out in 91-405. And those inspections have to be recorded by the technician. So here's a log entry of how that inspection might be documented. This one says that inspected NAVCOM number 2, deactivated under 91-213D. It's still in condition for safe operation. And that came about from a legal interpretation back in 2018. Rick Perry is the name of the petitioner, and that's when this determination was clarified. So if you're using an MEL for inoperative equipment, if it's not a 91 operator, make sure you follow the air carriers manuals, Part 121, 135. They'll have their MEL procedures. And the MEL, if there's an M procedure, which is a maintenance procedure, make sure that you make a maintenance record entry when you accomplish the M procedure. The repair categories A, B, C, and D must be observed by Part 121, 135 operators. And as stated earlier, those operators can request an extension for some of those categories if they're going to be exceeded. Now, deferrals for Part 91 MEL users, the repair categories don't apply. They have to repair, replace, or remove the inoperative item at the next inspection. Or if the proviso says, before or after 3 flight days or something to that effect, they do have to follow a interval specified in a proviso. And this is essentially the same as the 91-213D process, where they remove it, deactivate, and placard. I'm going to turn it over to Daryl Hughes from the North Texas FSDO, and he's going to take off with falsification of records.
Well, thank you, Gary. I found that to be quite interesting. We had a lot of comments during that your portion about suppliers and parts availability. I tried to answer most of those chats as I could. But right now, I think we're hitting the emphasis of why we're having this program today. I think the fact that we've had supply chain issues and everywhere is creating a lot of problems within the FAA and the aviation community that we previously never had to deal with before. One of those being falsifications of records, because we know that most aviation technicians and pilots, they're people of high integrity. This presentation is certainly not meant to cast a shadow over the character of any aviation professional, but as in any area, there are a few of those that push the envelope and cut corners. Our goal here is to inform you and enlighten everyone to mistakes so that or not resulting in an accident or a loss of someone's life. Or possibly certificate action on the certificate that provides your livelihood. Nobody wants to see that happen. So 4312 is a very important rule. It covers fraudulent or falsified records. And I want to point out that as long as you're open and honest and trustworthy, and you're not intentional is a big word in falsification of records, because we go after those folks that they know they're doing it and they know that they shouldn't have. It's not, we don't go after the folks that are false or that are making mistaken record entries. We have processes for fixing that. If you make a record entry and you realize later that it was a mistake, that you didn't mean to enter it in that fashion, we have a process by which you can fix that. You don't correct the entry you made. You just make another entry correcting the information that was incorrect in your original entry. That way there's nothing that looks like anything was trying to be covered or falsified by erasures or mark outs or corrections. So that's the process we use for mistaken entries in your maintenance log. Now, the non-availability of parts and products can be a hazard to safety. And we have even heard of folks falsifying records due, and it's just popped up recently, falsifying records due to the unavailability of parts. Well, what would that look like? Well, say you did a simple task like an oil change, and you wrote down that you replaced your oil and your filter, which would be normal for any maintenance practice that you do it in that regard. But did you actually replace the filter due to non-availability? That's where we're getting at it as far as falsifying records. If you didn't actually perform it because you couldn't get the part, don't say you did. That would fall in the intentional category that I just spoke of. So please don't do it. Next slide, Gary. Here's some examples of falsification or fraudulent entries. Don't try to deceive anyone. Bottom line is to be truthful and accurate. Remember, it is if you make a mistake and you're willing and able to work with the FAA, the compliance action program and the processes will be used, and you most likely not get in an enforcement situation. Just be truthful and honest with what you actually do as a maintenance professional. That's the best advice we can give you today. Next slide. So an entire presentation could be made just based on parts. I saw that earlier, that it's a very big part of aviation safety and has a lot of interest in it. Today, we would just briefly want to discuss parts to increase your awareness and help you identify an approved part and what an unapproved part is. It may find their way into the supply chain. As you all know, folks, parts in aviation is big money, and when there's big money involved, there's always these unscrupulous people that try to supplement the correct processes for getting approved parts into the aviation supply system. So we're just trying to give this presentation today to make you aware that that can happen. FAR Part 21 covers the manufacturing, replacement, and modification criteria for aircraft parts. FAR Part 45 covers how parts are marked for use in an airworthiness determination. So we're giving you ideas of what you can look for when you purchase parts to determine, are these really what I think they are, and am I eligible to install them in my aircraft as an approved part? Now, a few years ago, Part 3 was issued. That concerns false and misleading statements about products, parts, and appliances and materials. We didn't have that specific rule in place, but when they decided this would be very helpful in preventing that type of activity and give us some actionable items should we discover that be the case. Next slide, Gary. This is the definition by the FAA of a false and misleading statement. So if you intended to deceive, falsely represent the material other than what it actually is, or omits pertinent information that would otherwise deem the product unacceptable for installation, on a type certificated product, you have possibly made a false and misleading statement. Part 3 was instituted in 2005, as I mentioned earlier, to make those statements illegal and subject to criminal prosecution. We're not talking about compliance action. We're not talking about certificate revocation. We're talking jail time. So that was a very good rule that was put in, and I believe that it has enhanced and emphasized the illegality of using inappropriate parts in aviation products. Here are some examples of misrepresentations or misleading statements that you may run into. The enclosed part is equivalent to PMA part number PMA 2234-3006. That is a statement, but the fact the part is not FAA approved is omitted. Also, it implies that the part is acceptable for substitution. The second one, the enclosed part except for installation on the King Air 350 model aircraft, without any further basis or traceability to support the statement, is included with the part. So is it really eligible? And what is the validity, or what is the worth of that on a piece of paper? It wouldn't hold water for any validation of its eligibility to be installed on that King Air. The last one, the enclosed part is like new or remanufactured. Well, statements that are not necessarily fault, but contain an omission or misrepresentation about the product that may mislead the end user is also falls under this category we're speaking to as far as misrepresentation of documentation or verbiage on a parts document. Next slide, Gary. Articles approved for manufacture they're under, as I said earlier, under FAR Part 21, as referenced in Part 45, Subpart B, are the only parts required to be marked by regulation. So do all parts have to be marked? No, only those identified in the previous rule I cited have to be marked. Life limited parts definitely have to be marked. You will not, if you find a life limited part that you can't find a part number on, you just purchased a bogus unapproved part. And I just had Mr. Naylor ask, wouldn't a FAA 8130 form help clarify that the part is accepted or accepted? That is one of the forms, and absolutely, Mr. Naylor, that is one of the forms that is acceptable for use in determination of eligibility for a part in an aircraft or an engine or any other appliance, you name it. 8130s is our go-to. And most reputable manufacturers and even surplus part sellers have no problem issuing you an 8130 if you request it. Next slide, Gary. Articles, certification process for products and articles. We can't emphasize enough, FAA Part 21 has a volume of information on how these parts are approved and how you can determine whether they're eligible for use in your particular environment. So I would highly recommend, if you have not, to look at it. Other parts, such as standard parts, are generally marked in accordance with an established industry or U.S. government or international specification. But watch out for parts that are not properly marked. This could be an indication that it's an unairworthy part. So basically, Part 21 tells you how new aviation parts can be made. Articles approved for manufacture under Part 21 are authorized via production certificate under Subpart G. The products can be produced in accordance with the Subpart K as a PMA part, or as a technical standard order of production approval under Subpart O. So there's a variety of ways a part can be certified for approval under Part 21. Product approval is generally done through some sort of type certification or any other method approved by the FAA. Now, the question may be in your mind as to, are you telling me that every piece of every part on every airplane, engine, propeller, appliance, or appurtenance is produced under a TSO product, a TSO, a PMA, or some other method? Absolutely. The majority of parts, though, that you find are going to be parts that were approved in the original design or the original design by the aircraft certification under the type certificate data sheet. That's the blanket. That's the majority, how the majority of the parts are approved is when that airplane is designed, that engine designed, that appliance is designed, they seek types of certification for it, which includes down to the nut, bolt, and sometimes screw, what part is approved for use in that product. Next slide, Gary. So this advisory circular is a great way to establish and to gain more information into what is good and what is not good, what is approved and what is not approved. So looking in the FAR 21.8 and 21.9, as well as using this advisory circular, is a great source for information on parts. And this AC is probably the best for that use. Next slide, Gary. So what is an approved part? 2129, Advisory Circular 2129, detecting and reporting suspected unapproved parts, list 11 ways that a new part can be made. Just one moment, folks. I've got to plug in my computer. I got a low battery light showing here. Stand by one moment, please. Sorry about that. Okay, so there, as I said, there's 11 ways that a new part can be made, and there's 6 of them listed right there. Go ahead and go to the next page, Gary. Our list continues right here. Some of the things that you may not have been aware of that will be useful to you is individual owned or operated produced parts are acceptable. Repair stations in the process of making a repair on the product that the customer is giving them is acceptable also. But there's just as many ways to get a part approved or use an approved part as we've listed here. So be advised as to what you can use to make that determination. US specifications, yep, that's acceptable. Nuts, that includes nuts, bolts, hardware, such as AN and AMS, etc. I know you've heard those terms. The last item listed is an AN, which is means Army Navy specification. MS means military specification. And of course, there's NAPA specification. What does NAPA mean? Go ahead, Gary. Oh, no, Gary. NAPA does not mean not approved part for aviation. No. No, it really means North American or North American Automotive Parts Association. But you shouldn't be buying parts from NAPA or any other AutoZone to install an airplane. I mean, I think our audience is knowledgeable enough and professional enough to know better than to do that. It's important to know you are dealing with a reputable aviation parts vendor, though, and that's the most important part. The next slide, Gary. So here's what an unapproved part is: a part that fails to meet any of the approval requirements pursuant to 21.8 that I mentioned earlier or 21.9. These subsections speak to acceptable methods for new, replacement, and modification of article approvals. Basically, a part that does not meet any of these criteria that we just listed is an unapproved part. And we have ways to report that under the AC 2129 that we covered today. And we highly encourage that you do. We seek the support and collaboration of the industry and our stakeholders, and making sure that the whole aviation community as a whole is safe, and it takes everybody's part in ensuring that safety. Well, I hope you enjoyed my part of the presentation, and I guess, Gary, I think I want to turn it on. Oh, one more thing. In addition, an AD might deem a part to be unapproved as seen in this example. That happens. It happens rarely, but it is another circumstance where you may have a part that we thought was good to go, but we found out for whatever reason that it is no longer eligible and has serious manufacturing problem and jeopardizing the safety of flight, and we issue ADs to remove it. Gary, I'm going to let you pick it up from here and run, buddy.
All right, appreciate it, Daryl.
You're welcome.
Okay, other parts that are affected by the supply chain are life-limited parts, and they have a mandatory replacement time. So there's no wiggle room there. Once they reach their life limit, they have to be replaced. And this slide just gives the definition of a life-limited part from Part 4310. Here's an example from a type certificate data sheet where it shows the life limit of the Cessna P210. The windshield, cabin windows have to be retired after 13,000 hours. Here's a Bell helicopter. Chapter 4 is the airworthiness limitations section. And usually helicopters have a lot more life limited parts listed than a fixed wing. Now, the responsibility for life limited parts falls on the person removing the part. But here's just a reminder. Remember, the inspection performance rule says that each person performing an inspection shall perform the inspection so as to determine the aircraft or portions thereof meet all the applicable airworthiness requirements. And of course, that would include life limited parts. And the owner has a responsibility under 91403. They can't operate an aircraft unless the mandatory replacement times, inspection intervals, and related procedures contained in the airworthiness limitations section or an inspection program that they've selected under 91409E through F or contained in FAA issued op specs. And life limited parts are given expressed in the number of cycles, number of landings, time in service, calendar time, or a combination of all the above. So the goals related to life limited parts, it's to deter the installation of the part after it's reached its limit. So we have to track the life status of the part in order to do that. So each person who removes a life limited part has to do one of those 6 things to manage that part. You can have a record keeping system. You can attach a tag to the part, non-permanent marking, permanent marking, segregation, or mutilation, which is just destroying the part that's reached its life limit so that it doesn't get installed again. So let's look at some of the cause and effect of the supply problems that we're seeing. It may cause owners to produce more parts. It may require use of salvage parts. Instead of buying a new part, maybe you can find a used part. Maybe good or bad, allowing more wear and tear than you would normally allow. Suspected unapproved parts showing up in our system. Putting off oil changes. we could see a increase in the theft of parts. And maybe you're going to repair a part that you normally would replace. All of this results in more planning is probably needed before you start a job, just to make sure that you're going to have the parts and materials needed to finish the job. Of course, sometimes if you're doing an inspection, you won't know until you get there what's needed. But as a general rule, you might want to do a little more planning. So a little bit more on owner-produced parts. It is allowed under 21-303. The owner must participate in the production of the part in one of 5 ways. There was an FAA memo in '93. And some of those ways are: the owner provides the manufacturer of the part with the design or performance data. Number 2, the owner provides the manufacturer of the part with the materials. Number 3, the owner provides the manufacturer with fabrication processes or assembly methods. Number 4, the owner provides the manufacturer of the part with quality control procedures. And number 5, the owner personally supervises the manufacturer of the new part. And these parts are for maintaining or altering the owner's own product. They are not for sale, and they are considered a new part. Now, the owner may hire a skilled aviation maintenance technician to produce this part, but just keep in mind, they have to participate in one of those 5 ways in order for this to be considered an owner-produced part. A salvage part is nothing but a used part, but it still has to be in condition for return to service. And so just look at 4313, 439, and AC 2327 covers substitution of parts for vintage aircraft. So the performance rule says the condition of the aircraft, and that would also go for the part that is installed in the aircraft, is at least equal to original or properly altered condition. So make sure the part was approved for return to service by a person authorized to do so. And part 43.7 tells us who is authorized to approve for return to service. Also, make sure the part has not met its life limit. There should be good documentation on all life limited parts. As far as traceability, just a packing slip saying that this particular part is what is in the box doesn't mean it was returned to service by an appropriately authorized person. And as Daryl said, the 8130-3 form or equivalent could be a yellow tag from a repair station if that's what they're using in their system. But normally nowadays we see 8130-3s and with the return to service. So allowing more wear and tear, that's kind of a normal or natural response when you don't have a part available. A common area here is tire wear. You can rotate tires to get more use, but don't push the limits of wear and tear or damage. Either the part is airworthy or it is not. Remember, it has to conform to its type design and it must be in condition for safe operation. AC 20-97 is a good reference for tire wear. And Goodyear also has a nice tire care and maintenance manual on their website. So suspected unapproved parts, Daryl gave a good explanation of how to identify unapproved parts. So there could be more in the system. So increased vigilance is necessary by both mechanics and owners. And again, there's the AC, which is a really good, well, this is the AC for identifying unapproved parts, and then the AC for detecting and reporting SUPs, suspected unapproved parts, is AC 21-29. And I think it's at revision level D now. And by the way, you can find advisory circulars under FAA.gov under the regulations tab, and then click advisory circulars. So some more consequences of the supply chain problem. There's more pressure on owners and technicians. There's more temptation to bend the rules, putting off oil changes, maybe not changing the filter if you can't find a filter. I've heard that batteries are getting hard to get. So maybe battery servicing and maintenance becomes more important, keeping up on the batteries. Also, theft of parts is going to require more security measures. Kind of jumped ahead. Making parts for repairs instead of replacing them. That might be another consequence of this problem. So let's review best practices and some advice. Well, review the airworthiness requirements like we've done here tonight. What has to be installed, what has to be operative, what can be removed, and what can be inoperative. And we looked at all those things tonight, so I hope you have a better understanding of those items. Just use more scrutiny to recognize unapproved parts, better planning, as we discussed, better security measures. And I threw it in, make better landings to save your tires, but that's kind of a joke. But I think when parts and items are scarce, I think we all do have a habit of being more, maybe a little more careful, because we know that there's nothing there to make a repair. Stock up when parts are available, but don't hoard. And as mechanics, you can discuss the options with the customer. If they have an MEL, use the MEL. If not, and the criteria are met, you can use 91-213 for removal and placarding or deactivation. Restricting use, VFR only, for example, or day only, if it meets the requirement. Conduct more frequent inspections to identify failing parts or failed parts sooner, so that you can get that part on order. Service the batteries more often. Maybe produce a part that you can't obtain, or maybe you could find a salvage part. So in summary of what we've talked about tonight, airworthiness requires parts and materials. And airworthiness is defined by conformity to type design and in condition for safe operation. We looked at the responsibilities for AMTs and owners. We looked at the different types of parts: unapproved, approved, owner produced, salvage, and life limited. And we looked at falsification of parts and maintenance records. That's a big no-no. Just be honest and accurate in your entries. And if you make a mistake, Daryl discussed how you can make a correct entry. Then we looked at some of the causes and effects of the supply chain problems. And we looked at other consequences like theft of parts, increased unapproved parts in the system. And lastly, we looked at best practices and options for owners and technicians. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope that you learned something from it, or maybe it'll just increase your awareness. Again, if you've run into parts shortages, please put it in the chat. I think these chats are saved, and so we could go back in and maybe garner more information from your input. Daryl was, and Dan, are there any unanswered questions?
No, I didn't see any. We do have one unanswered question that was brought up to us earlier in the presentation about the the GoPro cameras. But before I address that, I would like to also put a plug in for the FASafety.gov website. The fact that you folks are with us tonight tells me that the majority of you probably have access to the website, and which describes our AMT and wings programs for the maintenance technicians and the pilots. But the emphasis of me plugging it is for you to maybe educate your fellow colleagues that may not be, and advise them that there's a lot of free information on our website that doesn't cost a dime, and it's very useful in your day-to-day activities in the aviation arena. So I want to make sure that we get that plug in. As far as the GoPro camera, the best way I can address the gentleman's question in regards to the GoPro camera is that it's not about the GoPro camera, because I'm not going to specifically address a particular product or item. It could be an iPad. It could be a number of things. And the emphasis is not that that iPad or that GoPro is installed in your airplane. What is important is what it is attached to in that airplane, because the attachment of anything that's permanently installed in the airplane must be installed in accordance with approved or acceptable data. Depends on if it's minor or major. So I know you're not holding it in your left hand and flying with your right the whole time. So you're putting it somewhere, and it should not be attached with Velcro. We don't allow it with ELTs. We don't allow it with GoPros or iPads. It's an inherently unsafe condition to have something that might come loose in the cockpit. And believe me, they can do a substantial amount of damage if they're not proper. The installation method that they're used to secure that product, whatever it is not done in an approved fashion acceptable to the FAA. So that's about all I can do in addressing that question. And hopefully that did answer the gentleman's question. If not, our email addresses are here. Feel free to jot them down, and any questions that you might have come up during this event that we did not answer, or that you didn't think of in time to get it on the presentation tonight, drop us a line. We'll take care of it for you. Other than that, Dan, do you have any comments, buddy? I guess not. Back to you, Gary.
All right, appreciate it. And I do want to thank Daryl and Dan for helping me out tonight. And I got a lot from their discussions as well. So
yeah,
I appreciate everybody attending, and this is worth some AMT and wings credit as specified in the announcement. So we will be awarding those. So thank you, and have a great night.
Good night.